I'm Dr. Vanessa Sinclair, and this is Rendering Unconscious. My guest today is Pablo Lerner, a psychologist from Gothenburg, Sweden, residing in Paris, offering psychoanalytic psychotherapies in private practice. He is the editor of the anthology Freud and the Death Drive that came out in 2021. Currently, he is working on a book entitled Speculating on the Edge of Psychoanalysis, Rings and Voids, which deals with the status of the void in Lacan's psychoanalysis and sheds new light on phenomena such as creation, poetry, solitude, grief, mysticism, the clinical structure, and the poetic art of interpretation. In particular, he is currently writing a chapter precisely about grief and death. He has contributed a chapter to a book I am editing currently on the work of filmmaker Ingmar Bergman from Freudian-Lacanian Perspectives. His contribution is Beyond Silence, on the absence of God in the films of Ingmar Bergman. For more, please visit his website, pablolerner.se. That's PABLOLERNER.se. As with all Rendering Unconscious podcast episodes, there is a video accompanying this episode at YouTube. Just visit Trapart Film's YouTube channel. That's TRAPART Film at YouTube, or search for Rendering Unconscious Podcast. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode. Rendering Unconscious is also a book, Rendering Unconscious, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry, from Trapart Books 2019. For more information, you can visit our publisher's website, trapart.net. That's TRAPART.net. You can support the podcast at our Patreon, patreon.com/Vanessa23Carl. That's VANESSA 23CARL. Your support is very appreciated. Thank you so much for supporting Rendering Unconscious Podcast and all of my other creative endeavors.
Let's start with death. You don't have to be like Blaise Pascal, who thought that everything was vain, having to do with science, mathematics, etc., to just focus on the topics of death and God, until the end of his life. You don't have to be that radical to argue that death is a quite, let's say, interesting subject and quite important for us human beings in general, and psychoanalysis perhaps in specifically. Now we encounter death every day when we work with our patients in the most diverse ways, and also naturally death in the theory of psychoanalysis from Freud onwards, it's had its vicissitudes. Let's say that it has been really difficult for our great thinkers to integrate it into our theory. So what is there to say about death? I don't know. let's find out.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of memento mori and always keeping it in mind in order to live your life to the fullest,
Yeah.
Appreciate every day. I'm a big fan of celebrating every day. Holidays are great, but I feel like every day when Carl and I have dinner, I'm like, this has been a great day. And I just I don't know, want to celebrate whatever I can in life, especially I think because I have had so many friends pass away, especially in the past couple of years. Yeah. And just in general, I'm just happy I'm still here. And yeah.
Of course. Yeah, there is a happiness that has to do obviously with valuing life, encountering death. But I think there is something other also, I think, that has to do with living in the proximity of it. Having the death close to you. Obviously, you have to learn how to grieve first, uh, but there is something very special about the specific quality about a bit being close to death, which is not only anxiety or horror or fear or something like that, but also beauty, I suppose. Being able to find a way, a constructive way, I assume, to relate to death, gives you another dimension, in the experience, of everyday life. Beauty.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can say I really only came to this attitude really relatively recently after grieving a close friend for over a year. And then since kind of her year anniversary of her murder passed, I've just been like feeling eternally grateful all of
Yeah.
a sudden.
Yeah. Exactly. Gratitude. Isn't it a beautiful feeling? Love. What is love without the feeling of gratitude? And there is something having to do also, I believe, with losing somebody you profoundly love. That you start to, like, living as such in some way becomes, given that it is like permeated by this sense of gratitude which you speak about, becomes something that has more to do with giving back, not necessarily giving back to those who don't exist anymore, but just giving back. It's nice. It's better than being preoccupied with yourself all the time. I believe, at least.
Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
also with this specific person, I think the fact that she was murdered really was different because I've had many friends pass away with the, cancer or, you know, accidents and things like that. But I think the fact that somebody else chose to take her life, it really like had a um, different effect on me in a way that I didn't really imagine
Yeah.
before because I'd never experienced something like that. So it was like because the perpetrator was like a very conscious choice on his part.
Yeah.
Just the fact that somebody could do that to somebody, especially they had been in a relationship for more than 5 years, and
Yeah.
I can't imagine what is going on there that somebody could choose to do that to their partner of 5 years, especially when she had children. It's just like it's just incomprehensible to me, and it really just like kind of opened up this chasm of like what humans are capable with. Of course, in theory, like or I've worked in hospitals or with perpetrators of crimes, but I think when it happens to someone so personally, just
Yeah.
like really hits you at a different kind of level.
Yeah. That's horror. What horror. What horror. What horror. My God. Yeah. I understand what you think. What you're saying. I think speaking like as clinicians. Theory. Yeah. Psychoanalysis perhaps has theorized about these things, and of course having a distance also to your patients when you speak about it, but these close experiences about death, I believe it is on that level that you as a psychoanalyst or clinician can start to speak about somebody, about with your patients about these topics. You have to have experienced it. I believe it's not the same thing. It can't be like cerebral, your relation to death in the clinical setting. But yeah, the horror of death and all its different tragic forms. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just like theory in general. Reading theory, I totally appreciate the philosophers that use psychoanalysis, but I feel like when you read theory and you understand it that way, but then you see kind of the theory playing out in your own life when you undergo analysis, it's just like also such a different level. You're like, oh, this is what Freud is talking about. This is what Lacan is talking about. When you can really like feel the scan, feel the cut, and
Yeah.
how that affects you, or feel the different theories that they're talking about, because of course they developed these theories through their practices and so they saw them as like clinical vignettes or cases of people first, and then came up with these kinds of theories through their work. So it's like kind of seeing it from that side is also a different way of understanding.
Yeah. Absolutely. Which brings us to Freud. He was obsessed with the theme about murder, of course, and of course he had also great difficulty of knowing how to meditate about it, think about it. Um, you know in Freudian psychoanalysis, proceeding from the conception that we are in principle like sexual beings, like, driven by the sexual drive, and the apparatus, psychical apparatus is a structure of thoughts serving to regulate, the course of the excitation, blah, 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 in accordance with the pleasure principle. How do you like integrate death in that? How do you integrate also murder in that? Freud, in that's the thing. Would you make an interpretation like this, to a person who has lived through something like that? For him, for Freud, he's quite explicit about it. Murder as such, the death wish towards the other, it's not real. It's not real. There cannot be a real, wish to murder somebody. It cannot be, simply because death is not an experience. Death is not a thought. There is no death beyond the pleasure principle, at least at the level of the drive. So, proceeding from this idea about the incestuous relationship with the mother and the rival entering, murder is something that basically just want to get rid of the one who stands in the way. And he says it's like explicitly, in unconscious, there is no death, there is no murder. The child only understands like being gone, and that's equal to death for them. They don't understand death. So basically, for him, I would argue at least that patricide in the case of the Oedipus complex, but murder in general is an act of love. There is nothing but love. There is nothing but the libido. There is nothing but sexuality. So there is a problem there, I think, in Freudian theory about how to integrate murder and death in a theory that basically revolves around wishes having to do with enjoyment. Yeah. And would you say that to a patient? Would you say that to somebody, who has really gone through murder, that it's profoundly on a profound level about love? It's complicated, isn't it? Try to translate that into clinical practice. I don't know if I recommend it. You can't speak with people like that.
And what about the other side of the coin, where it's like our life is only like kind of a detour because the real drive is just death?
Yeah, speaking about the death drive, right? Ooh, this is complicated. Ooh, this is really complicated. And I enjoy this very much. I've always thought that, I think that beyond the pressure principle, it's not about death at all. It's about life. He put this in a footnote in a later edition that this is his attempt to solve the riddle of life. And the question is, what does the introduction of the death drive then amounts to? He introduces all of these like clinical phenomena, repetition, etc. And the drive, as you say, is a form of return to an earlier state. The conservatism of the drive. Yes, but everything has to do with death. Everything has to do with death for Freud. With the introduction of the death drive, I think at least, is absolutely totally based on this myth about the origin of life. That's what's stunning, I suppose, about it, and conspicuous in many ways. Without this myth about the origin of life as some kind of chance event where some kind of excitation of stimulus or chemical organism suddenly emerge, and there was an automatic tendency to return to the inorganic state. Without that, there is nothing that legitimizes the word death to drive. Nothing. It's just based on this myth. The compulsion of to repeat can, of course, doesn't need the hypothesis that death is the absolute goal, in the sense that it is not what is after life but before life. It is not in need with this leap to the beyond. It is not a necessary implication, I believe, of the compulsion to repeat. But Freud's meditations about this is, I think, dependent on ideas about the courses of the event of the excitation. It's really boring, I think, in some sense. Freud's meditations about the death drive, in the most profound level, it's just about excitations. It's not poetic, it's not metaphysics, it's excitations, the automatic tendency to nivellate it, to return to level zero. That's what it is. And should you interpret that poetically? Should you like metaphorize it and and raise it to the level of, everyday experience, or should you do it to the level of, existential problems? I don't know, perhaps. But yeah, perhaps it was a desperate attempt by Freud to introduce it on the most profound level of his theory. But is it sufficient? I don't know. What do you think?
What did you learn? You of course just edited a book on the Beyond the Pleasure Principle, the 100th anniversary. What did you learn in editing that book?
Confusion, I think, is the correct one. Not necessarily that I am confused, but there is a confusion in the psychoanalytic field to account for it. Danny Nobus, who wrote the text to the book, said that no one has really taken Freud seriously and maintain his form of the death drive. Everyone who has made some kind of creative development of his idea has first killed the death drive, and then it has resurrected in a different form. So I think that basically psychoanalysis, given that one is tempted to do something about this concept, has to make rid of Freud's fundamental assumptions about the course of the excitation and take some of its effect and do something creative. And it's very interesting because there is, of course, some kind of fidelity to Freud in Klein, in Lacan, for example, André Green, but they are so different. They partially overlap, perhaps. They don't even contradict each other. They're not logically contradicting. They're separate, separated. Yeah, it's interesting because I believe that the theme of death still haunts, psychoanalysis, some kind of outsider, and different theories are confronted with the task of integrating it. But I think in some sense they are doomed to fail, and that makes it so incredibly interesting. Incredibly interesting. It makes psychoanalysis something else, I assume, than just scientific theory. It forces them to introduce. It's a eruption of that which is beyond the speakable, and to be able to integrate that is to play, is to approach the limit of the capacity of theory to make do, to account for these kinds of phenomena. But I believe that the most brilliant psychoanalysts that we have in the history, they have been very, very creative and very, very they have been very creative. Klein has been very creative. Bion and Lacan, naturally, very creative. And I think that you could at least argue that Laplanche, that a psychoanalyst who really has tried to revolutionize, on a profound level, has to confront this question in a singular way. Yeah, because it simply doesn't fit.
Yeah, but I love that about psychoanalysis, how that people can have theories that don't meet at all or that do contradict. And in New York, there's so many different psychoanalytic institutes and schools of these. There's 50. But people will have arguments trying to say well, so and so said this, and so that doesn't make sense with that, and the fact that one contradicted the other somehow negates what the other person said. But I just try not to do that at all, because I find that I get something out of most of these really creative thinkers, and I try to think. I kind of seeing. I mean, for me, I don't even really mind if I don't fully believe the ideas that I'm kind of working with. I just kind of like to see where ideas go sometimes, and just kind of keep pushing them and keep pushing them, and then okay, well, if that makes sense with that, then what about if we do this? See what happens, theoretically, not clinically, but
Yeah, that's right. And at some point, I believe that that's being faithful to Lacan, not necessarily reading him line by line and trying to memorize everything and structure everything in mathematical diagrams, but just read it like something incoherent and something strikes you, and then you should creatively do something. The same thing with the clinical practice in some sense. Yeah, and I think that that's perhaps authentic way to confront these questions. Just read the books and listen to the patients and live your life, and be open to the encounters with death, and things will happen with you. And proceeding from that, you will hopefully, depending on who you are, have something to say about it. but it has to be, it has to be you as a real human being, not as some kind of, functionary of, yeah. But I
No,
believe
that's exactly right. That's a beautiful way to put it, because I get frustrated when people get too bogged down with trying to kind of understand everything, especially with Lacan, of course. So many people, so many analysts that haven't been taught Lacan or had studies, Lacanian study groups, are afraid to kind of even go to the seminars. And I just tell them, just read it. You don't have to understand everything he's saying. Nobody does. It's fine. Just like read it and see what hits you. And every time you read it, it'll hit you differently. And it's kind of like, I think it's more like the practice, I feel like reading his seminars is like kind of like the experience of psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic theory in a way, where it kind of like sometimes it does go in a loop, and then you're like, oh wait, we're back here and this connects to this. And then sometimes you get a little like lost and you're like, wait, where was I? What was I talking about? And then it'll come back around, and you just kind of have to go with it and see where it leads, and not just get so caught up on on the exact things that he's saying all the time. So that's fun to do. I mean, I love doing close readings and like reading groups with other people. And like with David Lichtenstein, we had a study group. I think we read like one Cree, and it took us like 2 years to read one paper, because we were reading it line by line so closely. And that's really fun as well. But you don't have to do that, just like read it and take from it and think your own thoughts. Don't worry so much that you don't know all the references. You don't know all the different theorists exactly like nobody did when they started. Just like don't let that inhibit you.
Yeah, the challenge, I suppose, like at least like on the clinical level, is to forget it, but not totally, not really forget it, but just like forget it for a while, forget it. it stays there somewhere, but you can't.
Yeah, it's not going anywhere. So it gets in there. You don't have to consciously understand for it to be working on you.
The ghost of Lacan, yeah. Never lets you go. He haunts me. Anyhow, yeah, but speaking about, yeah, of course, like Memento Mori, which you spoke about, and this kind of, and the sense of, being close to beauty, or the whole, in lack of a better word, which accompanies the proximity to death, If you want to read somebody, something to be able to approach it, perhaps you should read the poets or the mystics or the religious literature, not necessarily psychoanalytic theory or like other theories for that sake, existential theory. Of course, it's important, but I want to believe at least that it's essential for the clinician to approach it differently than through theory. Yeah, in some way, I think. How do you interpret questions really on a profound level that has to do with death? How do you interpret it when a patient, have some kind of really strong emotion when he cries because he can, for the first time, like cry for the loss of, I don't know who they have loved? What do you say, and how do you say it? If you are going to say anything, which you perhaps shouldn't do, but if you are, I believe it is absolutely crucial to not to speak where the words, in a sense, reverberate differently than the everyday speech or this kind of, let us say, common interpretation on a psychodynamic level. It has to reverberate elsewhere, on the level of the beautiful, I think. I believe so. And that's why I try, at least to my colleagues, to say to them that they perhaps should read more poetry and less Freud sometimes, at least, and then return to Freud, then return to him, and then return to Lacan. But yeah, I believe that the topic of death is intimately linked to poetry. They're all obsessed about it for obvious reasons, and the mystics also, naturally. I think there's something to learn there. Yeah, I think so.
Absolutely. And Freud said that everywhere I go, there's always a poet that's been there before me.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Oh, about Freud and death and poets, for that sake, this wonderful little text on transience, where he retells this anecdote where he was strolling around like the land side with Rilke and Lou Andrea Salomé, viewing the beauty of the surrounding, like forest and stuff like that. And he was like totally shocked. He said that the young poet, Rilke, couldn't appreciate the beauty. He couldn't feel like joy for the beautiful around him because everything beautiful is doomed to perish, transience. And Freud had, I believe this is very humorous. Freud said, I literally quote him now, I did dispute the young pessimistic poet's view. He disputed him. And then he put forward like this argument about the value of the beautiful is scarcity value in time, and the limitation of the time of enjoyment raises its value, and it's independent of absolute duration. I don't know. Anyhow, I find it really fun to try to imagine this scenario where Freud, the scientist, tries to persuade Rilke, the poet, about the status of the beautiful on purely economic grounds. Yeah, and he simply didn't get it, because Rilke writes this afterwards that that Rilke and Lou Andrea Salome, they weren't like convinced. And he's right. My argument, I found it like perfect. You can't argue that this is wrong. This is true. But I couldn't understand why they weren't convinced. And then he like adds, but later I understood that it was a revolt, against mourning, which disturbed their judgment, something like that. I found that extremely symptomatic or telling in some way. Yeah. Obviously, perhaps he was absolutely right. Perhaps it just was a revolt, and perhaps it's like argument is absolutely correct, and but there was something he didn't get it. He didn't get it. Something is just lacking, and it's about beauty and death. Beauty and death. Rilke, perhaps he was, a young melancholic, couldn't mourn, just immature. What do I know? Personally, I don't believe that because Rilke is Rilke, but he got something there. He understood, the profound link between beauty and death. Freud didn't. I don't think he did.
No, I mean, that's my eternal frustration with Freud, but he's just such a man of like his era in that way, where he's like trying to kind of base everything in materiality and, like you said, economy and the body, and making everything like biological and scientifically proven. And you can see him like it's like his own neurosis, like fighting against his own nature, because he goes off on these like speculative tangents, and that's some of his best work. But Danny Nobis and I were talking the other day about, he's like, but like a lot of Freud's papers would never get published in a journal now. Some of them really he goes off and wanders, and that's the best part. But he's just like constantly like trying to box things back in and make them, all scientifically sound and proven. I just recently read, I don't even remember what it was. It was something like where it was actually right after he wrote Totem and Taboo, which is like clearly very kind of out there. And then he like comes back and he writes like a treatise on like, how psychoanalysis fits with like philosophy and biology and education and these different kind of more concrete factions. And it's just really funny for him to go on and on about how like the rigor of the psychoanalytic process, and how it's this like huge like scientific process that people have gone through, and that they've been able to prove these theories in these ways, as opposed to like the speculative philosophers. It's like, okay, Freud.
But you know what I think? Perhaps this is some kind of radical thought. I'm not trying to be provocative, but I think that Freud, it is not impossible, it's not unthinkable that he would conceive of Beyond the Pressure Principle as one of his most scientific works. For the simple reason, I think Ernst Jones in the same thing, he never abandon, his fundamental epistemologic position, which inherited by Ernst von Brücke, his teacher, basically the paradigm of Helmholtzian physical reductionism, basically of the hierarchical structure of the sciences, where in the base we have physics, then we have chemistry, biology, and the top there we have like psychology. In his theory of the drives and in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, well, he states that the drive is like some kind of limit concept between the body and the psyche. But this is like the first time in Beyond the Pressure Principle where he goes down to the absolute most fundamental level of science, that is, the biophysical terrain, the biophysical domain. he explicitly say this. This is the biophysical like standpoint. He says it's 1937, and yeah, the excitations, you know, which he speaks about, the stimuli, you know, it's not longer like the psychical energy, which is very abstract and very diffuse. We don't really know exactly what it is. Perhaps it's some kind of effect of the nervous system, and we don't know. But the excitations which he speaks about in Beyond the Pleasure Principle are clearly real. They're physical. They're physical, you know. So in that sense, he remained faithful to his, you know, scientific prehistory. And in one sense, according to that view, it was much more scientific than everything else he had written the rest of his career. So I wonder how Freud thought about it himself. You know, I wonder if he perceived it as something which reflected his seriousness. Of course, he understood that everyone would hate it and they would perceive it as bizarre and speculative, I think at least. But I believe that his refusal to give it up reflects his fidelity to some kind of physicalist reductionism. And this is like the only way he could truly, you know, integrate death on a fundamental level, more fundamental than the psychological one. It's down there at the inanimate level, you know, as a struggle between that and the biological fundamental force of the libido. You know, I wonder, I wonder why he thought about that. But that's, yeah, I found that interesting. Reading it like historically, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, it gives you, in relation to Entwurf, in relation to, you know, his prehistory, his formation, it, you know, you perceive it in another light. It don't become as speculative. It becomes like seriousness, and you take Freud serious in a way. At the same time, I think that it's quite reasonable to reject his speculation of the vicissitude of the little vesicle. You know, it's quite reasonable to do that, but you can perceive on a more fundamental level, you know, personally, how it is some kind of expression of scientific curiosity. Yeah, and not only speculative, you know, self-sabotage. Yeah, I don't know.
I love Beyond the Pleasure Principle. At the institute that I went to before I studied with the Lacanians, the professors there, a lot of them were like MD, like psychiatrists, and the person who was teaching the class, that late Freud section of the training, he basically just didn't teach it. He taught like the beginning part, and then he was like, after this, Freud, he's like, I'm an evolutionary biologist, and this whole death drive thing makes no sense. And he's like, Freud basically was getting senile and just like lost his mind and decided that it wasn't even worth teaching. And I was like, well, I would like to learn it.
Of course, of course, of course. You know, yeah, it's a wonderful text. I love it. I love it. It's one of those which I love most by Freud. You know, it's personal. It's a personal text. Yeah. I also love like Moses and monotheism for the very same reason. Freud, you know, he was obsessed with some kind of prosaic like theoretization, very rigorous and scientific about stuff happening in the psyche. But I actually believe, you know, this is my hypothesis, that there was something, you know, mystic about his capacity to invent stuff, you know. Yeah, we have like this Entwurf, this project for a scientific psychology, where he writes, of course, in the letter to Fleece, he was absolutely like inspired and exalted and wrote it like really, really rapidly. It's very visual, you know, very visual to its nature, which the rest of his work basically isn't. It's very prosaical. And yeah, you could like hypothesize that he like suddenly saw the course of the excitation and understood immediately, yeah, this is true, this is right, I've invented it, this is it, you know. And obviously we have to like take into account also all his obsessions with like creation myths, originary myths, you know, the original primordial scenes, the primordial father, the killing of him, the beginning of life and Beyond the Pleasure Principle, the little vesicle, you know. There is something having to do with the obsession about this, and it's obvious like break with everything scientific with the rest of him, which I think like is symptomatic to a part of Freud's way of thinking that has been forgotten or perhaps negated, which he himself, I believe, would like to repress. Perhaps he couldn't help himself. That's why I love Moses and monotheism. He couldn't help himself. He had to write it. It touched upon him profoundly. Of course, he was Jewish, but he couldn't help himself. He had to write it. Same with like the vicissitude of the vesicle in Beyond the Precipice. He had to do it. He just had to do it. It reflected his profound intuitions, where he, I believe, like saw the origin of everything, the origin of life. That's what he's writing about. He saw it, and then he has to try to integrate it into a theory that is highly prosaical and non-visual to its nature. So yeah, in the light of this, it's a sign of personal. I read him as very, very personal. You come closer to Freud's way of thinking, I believe, than when you read him like a theoretician. And I like that. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, exactly. No, I love it. And I just finished putting together a class on Freud's kind of relationship to philosophy for this for GCAS, for Global Institute for Advanced Studies, that I'm teaching at in the spring. And he talks about how the problem with philosophy is that every philosopher's philosophy is so individual to that person who's creating it, and such a reflection of their psychology, as if to say that psychoanalysis is not. And I thought that was pretty funny.
Of course. Well, of course. And speaking about the topic of death, everyone knows that Freud, let's say, he had a complicated relation to death. Very complicated. Well, it has been written, so many books about it. It began, I suppose, with his baby brother Julius, who was 1.5 years younger than him. He died before he was 1 year old. And Freud, when he was adult, he repeatedly said that his biggest preoccupation in his life was to die before his mother. And after she died, he could finally die in peace without guilt. He Jones writes somewhere that he always, sometimes at least, said. Took farewell with the words goodbye, perhaps we'll never see each other again. Freud had told Jones that he had Todesangst, death anxiety, every day, that he was obsessed with death all the time. Of course, he wrote it also on the preface to the second edition, to the interpretation of dreams, that he understood it retroactively. The interpretation of dreams, the writing of it. It was a reaction, to the death of his father. The death of his father, Jakob Freud, 1896. Yeah, it was the most important event he wrote, the most painful event for a man in his own life. And his auto-analysis, self-analysis, and the writing of interpretation of dreams is naturally intimately linked to his experience of it. And the Oedipus complex, of course, he writes to fleas, also me. I was in love with my mother, and I had murderous impulses to my father. He found it in a deeply personal, on a deeply personal level, descending into the realm of the dreams, his own dreams. There he found, psychoanalysis. And to read Jones, I believe, is way too radical when he says that, for example, the death drive, the introduction of the concept of the death drive, is just like a reflection of Freud's problems with death, and we should reject it, as purely a reflection of his psychology and nothing scientific, etc. But of course, it would be almost ridiculous and non-Freudian to read Freudian theory without taking into account Sigmund Freud, of course. But one should at the same time, take him, let the theory be also, and let Freud be. May he rest in peace. We should be kind towards him. But yeah, we shouldn't destroy his theory proceeding from a conception about his own problems. That would not be all right.
No, absolutely. I just find, it's just amazing how generative his theories have been. And I think that's what's so fantastic. That's like embodying of the kind of psychoanalytic spirit and practice, that you can read and come up with your own ideas, interpretations. And like I said before, I just really appreciate people who come up with their own ideas in their work and don't just feel like they have to memorize or regurgitate what like masters say,
Exactly. Well, but that's the thing, right? To be able to do this, of course, Lacan spoke about the return to Freud, but you have to kill the primal father also, in some way, symbolically at least. to find a new way to approach death in psychoanalysis. Yeah, you have to cut, in some way with it and find your own way. That's nice, I think. I since Freud, excommunicated everyone who was too critical towards him. I don't know if he would approve of this, but at the same time, I think that it's the only way of being faithful to his revolutionary novelty of the unconscious. You have to do it. You have to kill him.
No, that's a very good point. That's another thing when I was reading, that's basically when everyone says like, why did him and Jung break? And it's because of Jung's like spiritual occult beliefs and this kind of thing. And his not centralizing sexuality. But that's what the whole Zurich kind of institute broke away from Freud's psychoanalysis at that time as well, because they said exactly that, like that he had just become too dogmatic with his ideas and wanting people to adhere to the way he thought of it, instead of like they felt like before he was more encouraging of people like taking the ideas on, that he'd gotten like too dogmatic. So that happened early on. This is in 1914. But I think that's Lacan's great intervention. I love his theory and I love his work, but at the end of the day, I think that's really like the Lacanian intervention, was being like, who's making these decisions, taking the power out of the hands of the institutes and like putting it back not just in the analysts, but in individuals and people. You can't just look at the person supposed to know. You can't just look for a master. You have to kind of find your own position.
Exactly. It would be nice to like conceive of psychoanalysis, to try to like imagine a form of psychoanalysis without a pope, and which wouldn't like descend into some kind of state of Trotskyism. That would be nice, but it seems that it's quite a challenge for us, to
just the people. That's what I've learned. Any people and in any groups always like start making hierarchies, and it's just like what humans do. Something about our kind of, we're like pack-minded in that way or something, where once we're like in a group, we just start like positioning ourselves in relation to one another in certain ways that has been happening for probably all of time. All of human time.
Exactly. But there's something there also having to do with like being faithful to Lacan. Lacan obviously theoretically was revolutionary, etc. But at least they say now that he got excommunicated from the International Psychoanalytic Association because of his radical intervention, radical like changes in the clinical practice now. And psychoanalysis, for me, it's obvious, theory, sure, but it's a practice. It's a clinical practice. That's what it is, And of course, there is some dogmaticism on how we should do this work, and that you can be. There is like this hierarchical, like dogmatic, like structural ways that you should like pass through this, and you should work like this, and if you don't do it, you're not a psychoanalyst and stuff. But like the spirit of Lacan, I believe, more than Freud, is to do it your way, and perhaps it will go to hell. Perhaps you will be like just rubbish, but do it. Follow your desire. I don't know, even if it kills you. Making reference to the death drive, of course. Yeah, I believe that there is something to do with the singularity of the psychoanalyst. And the way that you place yourself in the clinical setting, that at least after Lacan, that one should take into account, and which goes like collides with the way it tends to be structured in many of the schools today. I find it very sad. Yeah, I think you should speak to each other like psychoanalysts proceeding from the clinical practice. Absolutely, and listen to each other closely, and don't try to do the same thing.
Me too.
Yeah.
I also want to make sure we mention the Bergman book. So I'm editing a book on Psychoanalytic Perspectives of Ingmar Bergman, and you wrote a piece. So would you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, yes, it was a while ago, but sure, I wrote this text, which is called Beyond Silence, on the absence of God in the films of Ingmar Bergman. well, it is a psychoanalytic perspective of the absence of God in the films of Ingmar Bergman, basically. So I make some kind of, I watch closely The Seventh Seal, Through a Mirror Darkly, and Winterlight, where Freud Bergman dwells or is preoccupied, try to depict the problem having to do with the human being's relation to God and his absence. And many of the films, two of them at least, principally, of course, The Seventh Seal revolves around the question of death and God. And yeah, but we could put death aside and try to. Bergman has like two different ways of depicting man's relation to the eventual absence of God. One is God the Father, God who abandoned Christ on the cross, God who is this kind of point of reference for the prayers of man, the lamentations of man, the appeals of man. Show yourself, God, God, talk to me, answer my prayers, you know, the name of the Father, basically, which is placed on some kind of symbolical position in the void of the symbolic up there, the God that doesn't exist, as Lacan would say. On the other hand, and this is like, we could argue at least the God of the Old Testament, you know, broadly speaking. And the other part, which is Lacan's, Bergman's later way of approaching the question about God, is precisely the one that is closer to let's say, the interpretation of Christ, which we find in the Testament of Saint John, namely that God is love, love is God, and that there is something to do with the absence of God on this level, which is equated with lovelessness, a lack of love, absence of love. That is the absence of Christ, you know. And this is the predicament of the human being thrown out into a world, according to him, my interpretation at least, being thrown into a world where there is no love, basically. There is a lack of love, there is loss, there is death. And this is the precondition, you know, for the emergence of love within. In some sense, the death of Christ, understood as a death of God, understood as the absence of love, you know, forces man to confront this void and to give, you know, to love. The lack of love in the world is a responsibility of the human being who lacks love, you know, to be able to love. And yeah, he approaches that position more and more, you know. He actually wrote about it in his textbooks, how do you call it, his journal, that the more he thought about it, the more like topics like eternity, paradise, etc., got like reasonable to him when he understood that God is love. You know, one could think about well, the I think it's Saint John also. You know, where is God? Where you are not. The realm of God is within you. He gets there, Bergman. He gets there. With that being said, I think that there is something that is missing in his kinds of stagings of the question about the absence of God. Not only the lack of, you know, the answer of the God the Father, not only the lack of love, but also the lack of this dimension of the spiritual or the religious, which we could ascribe to, let's say, polytheism or animism or mysticism, which would be then this feeling, overwhelming awe, you know, which you could imagine that people can be overwhelmed by when we encounter the unimaginable, the natural phenomenon, you know, lightning, volcanoes, whirlwinds, and which at least historically was understood as a confrontation, not with God, but with a God. It's a significant difference. There is something having to do with the absence of God in his movies, which I argue at least is not really there. And that is the kind of encounter with the divine that corresponds to the phenomenology of polytheism. Yeah, and he himself says it somewhere that he tried, he tried, to try to depict this kind of almost dreamlike beauty where the divine is present in this way, and he failed miserably. And he wrote that Tarkovsky was the greatest of them all, the greatest of them all. He managed to do this perfectly, although naturally Tarkovsky was monotheist, was Christian. I would at least argue that that his films are like permeated by this sense of the divine and of awe, which we human beings a couple of millennia ago, not too many of actually, encountered, live close by in our relationship to nature, basically. Yeah. And with civilization and with this kind of monotheistic centralization of the prosaic reading of the law, for example, this dimension tends to be lost, and those who manage to profoundly experience it's many times, at least I think, a personal experience, and those who really speak about this are the mystics, the mystics. And I believe that this mystic dimension, at least, was more present in the polytheistic and animistic time, and that aspect of the absence of God, isn't there. That is the absence of the mystic, the absence of the dimension of awe. That is lacking in Bergman's film. It is, let's say, I am Swedish. It's Swedish. It's austere, it's melancholic, it's emptiness, it's black, that's lacking. There's something lacking there. And there I think that you could turn towards Tarkovsky and find another way to approach the question about the absence and presence of God. Yeah, something like that.
That's fantastic. And I totally agree. I feel like, to me, in my mind, like monotheism and then the kind of evangelical turn towards like everyone else has to believe this also, and like putting it upon people through the Crusades and everything. It's like directly led into like colonialism and capitalism, and us thinking that we're like apart from and better than the earth and the other creatures, and that kind of distance has led us to like be able to just destroy things to this degree and like think that we're kind of above it.
Yeah, I agree totally. It's sad. Think about it. We can't even like watch the night sky anymore. It's sad. Think about like actually living beneath it.
Yeah, imagine what that was like. I think I think about this all the time. I think I've probably seen like a full night sky of stars like less than 10 times in my entire life. And then you think about how people just like lived under that all of the time. And anytime I've seen it, it's so awe-inspiring. Just, just that it's like, how could you not be in awe? Of course, I'm sure things were terrifying as well, and maybe they go together, but like, how could you not be in awe at the wonder of the earth when you're actually like living in it, exactly. Not feeling so apart from it.
And then we can like dethrone the human being and civilization. One could, perhaps it's not true, but you could say it at least, and it's beautiful. You can conceive at least that like men didn't invent writing, for example, but that discovered writing by watching the stars, and interpreting them like gods or like signs of God. That's what Schreber talks about, of course, the relationship between the stars and God's language. You could like understand this dimension, trying to, if we like erase the civilization as we know it and just put ourselves there, I think you can try to understand that we human beings are perhaps not responsible for the existence of civilization, or the thing that we at least conceive of as fundamental to it. For example, language, for example, religion, for example, writing. Perhaps we didn't invent it. Perhaps we found it. Perhaps we found it in language. Vico has this amazing myth about the origin of language, also about lightning striking down. Suddenly and the original man who didn't speak like got totally awestruck and understood that the lightning was a god trying to speak to him, with lightning, and language was discovered, not invented, discovered. And he, this is quite fun also. He said that the first language, onomatopoetic, they tried to imitate it. So the first word was ba. It was trying to how do you call it, imitate it, and then like they repeated it, papa. So the first word was papa, daddy. But he has this beautiful line where he said that the human beings in the origin of the history of the humankind experience nature as the language of the gods. It's the same thing there. The fundamental elements of our world, our civilization, we didn't create it. It came to us. We found it, and we constructed something on the basis of that, which totally at the end like excluded it. And we make ourselves the masters of the world and master of everything. It's sad. It's very sad. This dimension of the divine. Everyone's searching for it nowadays, spirituality and stuff. I don't know. Do they found it? I don't know. I believe it comes to you. Perhaps you can't like find it like Picasso, I don't search, I find. It comes to you, I think. And it's difficult today to encounter it. Where do you find it? Where did it come to you? Where? I don't know. Yeah. That's like, the sensation of the sublime, and of it forces you to confront the impotence of language, and there it gives you this like impetus to proceed to approach poetry exactly in the same way as we do with the encounter of death, because I believe actually that they're operating these two kinds of phenomenon, on the one hand, this night sky and then the natural phenomena, and death, it's the same level. It's basically the same level. It's basically the same, feelings. It's the same disposition. I believe it. I believe it is, actually. And that's why I believe you should read poetry and mysticism more than Freud if you want to be able to say something meaningful to patients who suffer because of that. That's what I think.
Thank you for listening to Rendering Unconscious. You've just heard a discussion with Pablo Lerner. For more, you can visit his website, pablolerner.se. You can visit my website, drvanessasinclair.net, or the podcast main website, renderingunconscious.org, for links and more information. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram at rawsin_. That's RAWSIN_. And now the song, The Primary Power of Sound, from a collaboration I did with Swedish artist Per Åhlund, available at Highbrow Lowlife's Bandcamp page. That's highbrowlowlife.bandcamp.com. Also available as a limited edition CD that includes my original artwork at Trapart.net. Life. Perhaps the primary power of sound, and this is especially true with regard to metaphonics. It is in its relationship to time. More specifically, this relationship is expressed by sounds. The ability to achieve various degrees of time dilation, relative, subjective experiences of duration, relative, subjective experiences of duration. We will realize that in each fragment, no matter how small, large, no matter how small, large or irregular, we will realize that in each fragment, no matter how small, large, no matter how small, large or irregular, it is in its relationship to time. As most of us are aware by now, if we shatter and scatter any hologram, we will realize that in each fragment, no matter how small, large, or irregular, we will see the whole hologram.